So during the November debate, Tulsi Gabbard confronted Pete Buttigieg regarding comments that Buttigieg had made just days previous to the debate taking place. Unfortunate timing, I guess. So Buttigieg was asked a question during an interview regarding whether he would send troops to Mexico to combat the cartels, which is something Trump has stated he wants to do. And Buttigieg appears to say yes. Without saying yes. Argues for security cooperation, and I'll show you the full context of Buttigieg's answer. But first, I want to show you where Tulsi Gabbard confronts Buttigieg and where Buttigieg just completely tears into Tulsi Gabbard. Take a look at this clip from the debate.
But I want to get back to Pete Buttigieg and his comment about experience. Pete, you'll agree that the service that we both have provided to our country as veterans by itself does not qualify us to serve as commander-in-chief. I think the most recent example of your inexperience in national security and foreign policy came from your recent careless statement about how you as president would be willing to send our troops to Mexico to fight the cartels. As commander-in-chief, leader of our armed forces, I bring extensive experience serving for 7 years in Congress, on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on the Armed Services Committee, on the Homeland Security Committee, meeting with leaders of countries around the world, working with military commanders of different commands, dealing with high-level national security briefings, understanding what's necessary, the preparation that I've gotten to walk in on day one to serve as commander-in-chief.
Congresswoman, thank you. Mr. Mayor, I'll allow you to respond.
I know that it's par for the course in Washington to take remarks out of context, but that is outlandish even by the standards of today's politics.
Are you saying that you didn't say that?
I was talking about U.S.-Mexico cooperation. We've been doing security cooperation with Mexico for years, with law enforcement cooperation and a military relationship that could continue to be developed with training relationships, for example. Do you seriously think anybody on this stage is proposing invading Mexico?
That's not what I said.
I'm talking about building up alliances. And if your question is about experience, let's also talk about judgment. One of the foreign leaders you mentioned meeting was Bashar al-Assad. I have, in my experience, such as it is, whether you think it counts or not, since it wasn't accumulated in Washington, enough judgment that I would not have sat down with a murderous dictator like that.
Congresswoman Gabbard, let me allow you to respond.
Thank you. You were asked directly whether you would send our troops to Mexico to fight cartels, and your answer was yes. The fact checkers can check this out. No. But your point about judgment is absolutely correct. Our commander-in-chief does need to have good judgment. And what you've just pointed out is that you would lack the courage to meet with both adversaries and friends to ensure the peace and national security of our nation. I take the example of those leaders who have come before us, leaders like JFK, who met with Khrushchev, like Roosevelt, who met with Stalin,
like Donald Trump,
Reagan,
who met
like Reagan, who met and worked with Gorbachev. These issues of national security are incredibly important. I will meet with and do what is necessary to make sure that no more of our brothers and sisters in uniform are needlessly sent into harm's way fighting regime change wars that undermine our national security. I'll bring real leadership and experience to the White House.
I've got to respond.
Senator Sanders, I'm going to have to respond.
Okay, so look, I like Tulsi Gabbard. I like her as a candidate. I like that she's progressive. I like that she's anti-war, and there are certain things I can pick apart from her that I don't like, but for the most part, she is a very positive presence for the progressive movement to have on stage. I like that she was an early supporter of Bernie Sanders. I like how she went to bat for him, and in that process lost a very influential position as vice president of the DNC back in the 2016 Democratic primary. I like that she's a diplomat, even when everyone wants her to advocate on behalf of regime change, that she doesn't. And she goes to such lengths as to make the very unpopular move of meeting with Bashar al-Assad. Now, look, I like these things about her, and you may be detested that I like these things about her. But I'm just telling you where I stand. But even if I were watching this interview at neutral, Tulsi Gabbard, I don't have an opinion of her. Let's just pretend. Pete Buttigieg, I have no opinion of him. I look at this clip and I think, wow, Buttigieg is a schmuck. That was a schmucky response. And I'll break it down as to why I think that. First of all, Buttigieg, he acts super angry, oh my gosh, I can't believe you misinterpreted my remarks. This is par for the course. But, I've seen everything or whatever. Look, don't act like you're so mad, like it's so irrational to interpret your remarks, Buttigieg, as advocating for putting troops in Mexico. Because that's exactly what you said in the interview. And the Sacramento Bee even reported it that way. Headline, Buttigieg says he would put troops in Mexico. Tulsi Gabbard is not alone in interpreting your remarks this way. It's up to you to be specific if asked about whether you would put troops in Mexico. If you want to say no, then say no. Don't dance around and say all these things that would have to take place for you to put troops in Mexico, which it's fine to make conditional statements. But again, when you do make those conditional statements, it begs for more detail. I want to know more. Will you say you would put troops in Mexico for security cooperation? Which, by the way, during that interview, when Buttigieg spoke with the interviewer about whether he would put troops in Mexico, he did not say anything about law enforcement cooperation, training relationships. Now, this is first of all, training relationships, saying, oh yeah, I'd put troops in Mexico because training relationships. No, those have different connotations. When you say troops in Mexico, we're not thinking like, okay, yeah, 10 troops to train Mexican soldiers to deal with the cartels. No, that's a very specific idea. So when you're asked about putting troops in Mexico, you can't just say security. Oh yeah, well, for security cooperation, and then not go into the detail that kind of answer deserves, which you will see what I'm talking about whenever you see the actual clip from the interview. But this was gaslighting. He gaslighted Tulsi Gabbard. Not cool. And then he goes on to he did seek to clarify his answer, which if he were being an honest actor, he could have clarified his answer on the spot and said exactly what he had said about, look, what I meant was law enforcement cooperation and training relationships. Whenever I heard that interviewer talk about putting troops in Mexico, that's where my mind went. I'm sorry, that's my bad. I wasn't clear enough. And then if he wanted to, he could proceed to attack Tulsi in whatever way he wanted. But at least that much would have been honest, right? Or at least have, it wouldn't have been gaslighting is what I'm getting at. He's gaslighting Tulsi, making her seem like it was irrational interpretation. And he goes and mischaracterizes her words as part of this process, saying, nobody, what? You think I'm proposing invading Mexico? No, that's not that's not what she said at all. And so he's mischaracterizing her further, a further form of gaslighting, making her seem so deeply irrational. Do you not think that's disgusting? Even if you support Pete Buttigieg, even if you love him, you have a shirt that says, I heart Pete Buttigieg. Are you not disgusted by that? Are you not I guess you will be once you see the actual interview and how it was a very plausible interpretation of his words. So mischaracterizes her and then slanders her with a number of talking points. And so that she's an Assad apologist, which is so commonly uttered with regard to Tulsi Gabbard that I imagine, folks that have heard this line have never heard the counterpoints of how she is not an Assad apologist. It pisses me off because every interview she steps into, she's asked about Bashar al-Assad. Will you condemn him right here? And she says, yeah, he's a brutal dictator. I've said it in every interview. It's like required of Tulsi Gabbard when she steps into an interview. You got to say he's a brutal dictator. And you know what happens right after that interview ends? You have people like Joy-Ann Reid saying, I don't understand why Tulsi Gabbard won't call him a brutal dictator. What are you talking about? You have to be deliberately ignorant. So... Assad apologist was one of the lines that Buttigieg used. And another, he went into saying he was critical of this idea of meeting with leaders of adversarial nations. And as Tulsi Gabbard is giving a string of rather good examples of when well-known leaders sat down with leaders of adversarial nations, Pete Buttigieg, rather like a child, interjects and says, you mean like Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un? I don't know what to say, except, first of all, the media, even though Trump is certainly far from the ideal person you want meeting with any leader, because he's a buffoon, your words, Buttigieg, are implying that meeting with Kim Jong-un is a bad idea. And you sound a lot like the Republicans of 2008 who were just dead set against ever meeting with the leader of Iran. Ever. And that's what the Democrats have sadly become with respect to North Korea and with respect to Syria. So the Democrats are in a bad place right now. But let me talk about the media reaction to the exchange between Tulsi Gabbard and Pete Buttigieg. Now, NBC, they write, Buttigieg, newly minted frontrunner, escapes fifth debate unscathed. And they write, the only candidate who made a direct attack on the mayor was Representative Tulsi Gabbard of Hawaii, but he appeared to win the crowd back to his side and pummeled Gabbard's question to him as outlandish, becoming the first candidate to hit her in a debate for meeting with Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. All right. Well, part of me was thinking, well, I may not even look at this article or read this article or touch on it. But the thing is, reading through the article, it does look like it's entirely optics driven. So I don't want to bash the article too hard. So I don't necessarily feel an article designed to be optics driven, though I wish it had said it was, should be treated the same as other articles. Call me a softie. But even though they fail to address the substance of whether Tulsi Gabbard was correct and Pete Buttigieg was wrong on the point of sending troops into Mexico, I'll be nice and give that article a pass because it looked entirely optics driven, that whole article. Even though if I were the head of a news division, if you're going to be optics driven, say it. Otherwise, it just looks like a trash article that was written on possibly a deadline. So anyways, here's another article, and this one's from MSNBC. Did Pete Buttigieg say he would send troops to Mexico, as Tulsi Gabbard claimed? And excuse me, maybe it's not fair to call it an article per se. It's a fact check. And this fact check did not note whether this was a fact or not that Buttigieg said this. You're sort of left to determine that on your own. And I wish, a fact check would just call balls and strikes and say, yeah, Tulsi Gabbard was right. Anyways, the article reads, here's what the mayor actually said at the California event recently, according to the Sacramento Bee, responding to a question related to gang and drug violence. Okay, look, it wasn't just gang and drug violence. It was specifically troops in Mexico to fight the cartels. I'm sorry, but if you're doing a fact check, be specific because this is all very specific. Did Buttigieg say yes to troops in Mexico to fight cartels? The answer is yes. And when you paraphrase like this, you're not doing a service to the specificity of what Buttigieg said. Now, here's the quote from the article. which you'll see in the video later, there is a scenario where we could have security cooperation, Buttigieg said, adding, I'd only order American troops into conflict if American lives were on the line and if it was necessary to meet treaty obligations. And yeah, that's what he said. That's part of what he said. Very little was left out because the answer was somewhat short. The Rolling Stone, they wrote, tough night for Tulsi Gabbard. And you know what? That's completely fair. Completely fair to write about how it was a very tough night for Tulsi Gabbard. She was taking hits from Kamala Harris. She was taking hits from Pete Buttigieg. And you know what? In their last paragraph, they did note that, for what it's worth, Buttigieg, when asked directly, do you see a time when troops can go into Mexico if Mexico welcomed it, for instance, he replied, there's a scenario where we could have security cooperation as we do with countries around the world. Now look, great. I'm glad at least Rolling Stone was able to put it in a fair context because Pete Buttigieg didn't elaborate all that much, which there's also an LA Times article which frustrated me so bad. I'm going to talk about it last. It deserves more attention than these other articles. This was just sort of in passing how media reported it. But let me show you the actual clip that's in question. Buttigieg and an interviewer talking about sending troops to Mexico.
Mayor, after a number of Americans were murdered in northern Mexico, President Trump suggested sending U.S. troops to help Mexico deal with the cartels. With your military experience, is there a way to deal with the cartels that doesn't violate Mexico's sovereignty?
Well, one of the biggest things I learned during my time deployed abroad is the importance of our alliances, our friendships. And this president, needless to say, has destroyed just about every relationship he can find. That makes America less safe, whether it is turning our back on Kurdish allies who put their lives on the line to help us fight ISIS, or right here in our own hemisphere, alienating those very countries that we need to have a better partnership with. Remember, it is in the interest of both the United States and Mexico for Mexico to prosper with greater economic success and security than they have right now. So if it is in the context of a security partnership, then I would welcome ways to make sure that America is doing what we can to ensure that our neighbor to the south is secure. But doing it in a way that calls into question Mexican sovereignty completely misses how we got here. And by the way, a lot of this is a question of the demand side on the United States. Part of what we can do is make drug trafficking less profitable by walking away from the failed war on drugs here in the United States. That is a policy that we know through experience hasn't worked. We got to do our part here at home and partner with other countries abroad.
But Mayor, specifically, do you see a time when troops could go into Mexico if Mexico welcomed it, for instance?
There is a scenario where we could have security cooperation as we do with countries around the world. Now, I would only order American troops into conflict if there were no other choice, if American lives were on the line, and if this were necessary in order for us to uphold our treaty obligations. But we could absolutely be in some kind of partnership role if and only if it is welcomed by our partners south of the border.
The interviewer asked, would you put troops in Mexico to fight cartels? He says, immediately, the first words to spill from his mouth, if it is in the context of a security partnership, then I welcome ways our neighbor to the south is secure. Now, there's many ways to interpret this. And what I mean is Buttigieg's intent. Now, perhaps he thinks sending troops to Mexico is a good idea. I don't know. Or he just doesn't know what to say on foreign policy, which is more believable that he would have memorized talking points on the subject of security in Mexico and that security relationship or cooperation. And he had those talking points. He hears the words Mexico, troops, and just sort of spits those talking points out. Now, Buttigieg's weak point is foreign policy. He's a mayor from South Bend, Indiana. And there's not a lot of foreign policy experience there. And it's unsurprising that he doesn't know much about foreign policy. So he's having to deliver a lot of answers on a lot of complicated questions. And it's easy to just say, security cooperation. It's the interviewer asks a question about Mexico, and he just barks out security cooperation. And then you're insane if you think that saying that in response to a question about troops in Mexico to fight the cartels, if you're insane to think that that is saying that he would put troops in Mexico. That's gaslighting. He gaslighted Tulsi Gabbard, and he gaslighted everybody who also interpreted his remarks that way. The more noble thing to do would be, look, I was a bit vague. I was a bit vague on that answer. When I heard, a question related to the security of Mexico, I immediately responded and talked about how we need to have a security cooperation. And I didn't mean to suggest that I would do such a thing, which is out, it's out. And then he could lambaste the very idea of sending troops into Mexico. And then he could say whatever he wanted about Tulsi. It'd be a more noble way or more honest way to handle the situation. But instead, he made her seem irrational and then mischaracterized her remarks, as I already stated. Now, some of the ways that he attacked her, she's an Assad apologist. The reason people state that she's an Assad apologist is that she had the audacity to meet with Bashar al-Assad, which is a dictator of Syria who we are at war with. And I know we like to emphasize in the United States that he's brutal, and that's why we need to get rid of this guy. But the fact is, we support brutal dictators. There's only some that we don't support. And that is not because they are brutal, it is because that they are not our ally. They don't do what we want. He's an ally of Russia. And there's also money to be made. Though there's not a lot of oil directly in Syria, there is, they are in the path of various oil pipeline proposals. Now, that's reason enough for both Russia and the United States to want somebody favorable to their interests in charge. So you have balance of power, you have resources, all at stake. That's usually the case. That's usually the underlying cause of war. It's not because we give so much a damn about other countries. That's how you rally support from the world. In any event, Assad apologist, that's what you get for having the audacity to try to approach the issue diplomatically with words to the leader of the adversarial nation, instead of just saying, yeah, I support overthrowing that person, because that's the Washington stance, is we got to overthrow this guy. And Tulsi doesn't buy it. She doesn't like the idea of going into countries and overthrowing their leader, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Libya, whether it's Syria. That doesn't make her a Gaddafi apologist. That doesn't make her a Saddam Hussein apologist, and it doesn't make her an Assad apologist. And another reason people crack down on her for being an Assad apologist is because she didn't back. She was the only one not to a resolution stating that Bashar al-Assad is a war criminal. Now, the reason that she did not back this is highly ignored, but the stated rationale from her is that these resolutions precede the United States militarily intervening and ousting a leader of a nation. And she's not wrong about that. These resolutions do precede that act of regime change, which she is against the act of regime change. Now, you can argue that this isn't the right way to oppose the Syrian war. You can argue that, and you can argue, well, this is a correlation, not a causation. This resolution preceding the ouster of a leader. You can argue that as well. Okay, but understand her rationale. And if you don't understand it, then I guess I could get where you're coming from, that she's an Assad apologist. But it's a very simple rationale. It's very simple, elementary. And the fact that these media pundits still don't get it, it's a bit suspicious. They're either extremely ignorant and unresearched on things that you should be researched on before you start lambasting someone as supporting a dictator. You might want to research on what you're talking about, or they're actively propagandistic towards somebody who is a threat to the status quo. Now, I'm willing to bet it's a mix of the two, depending on which pundit you're talking about. So, Buttigieg, is he ignorant? Is he propagandistic? Well, I happen to think he's just opportunistic, and he saw an easy way to give a crippling blow to Tulsi Gabbard, and he took it. And as far as him demonizing the act of Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un, I already mentioned that Trump is not who you want meeting with Kim Jong-un, and I think I pretty much covered this to some extent. But what I didn't cover was how media reacted to that. And here's what the LA Times reported in response to Tulsi Gabbard's list of noteworthy moments where a U.S. leader met with the leader of an adversarial nation. Here's the LA Times reaction to that. They stated, all of those summits come with asterisks, however. The United States and the Soviet Union were allies against Nazi Germany when Stalin and Roosevelt met during World War II. Kennedy's meeting with Khrushchev in 1961 has long been regarded as a diplomatic disaster that was soon followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, and Gorbachev was a reformer who ushered in an era of political openness in the Soviet Union. Okay, so I feel like those asterisks could themselves use asterisks, but the thing that's more telling about that article was that they offered a link to a tweet by Buttigieg's campaign about the fuller context of the interview where Buttigieg made his remarks about troops in Mexico, but they didn't offer any analysis. And one thing I would have mentioned would have been that the fact that the Sacramento Bee even interpreted his remarks as suggesting that they would put troops into Mexico. Or that Buttigieg would put troops into Mexico. It was not an irrational interpretation, and the LA Times shows their bias by not handling his remarks with the kind of scrutiny that they treated Gabbard's remarks about meeting with the leader of adversarial nations. And what's worse is that they would make this statement, putting an asterisk next to her examples, without noting the many, many cases of which it is important for the United States to sit down, or the many examples of when it is important or has been important for the United States to sit down with a leader of an adversarial nation. And I don't see how that doesn't immediately pop into your mind when writing this article or when criticizing Tulsi Gabbard's examples. In fact, you know what? It's cool. You can criticize Tulsi Gabbard's examples, but how? How does it not come to mind of the necessity of meeting with the leaders of an adversarial nation? As far as Gorbachev saying, oh, well, Gorbachev doesn't count. He was a reformer. Well, think about all the times the United States sat down with Russian leaders before Gorbachev came into office and during the Cold War. Even Henry Kissinger thought it was a good idea. Henry Kissinger, who sat down with Mao Zedong during the brutalities during the Great Leap Forward. He didn't say, oh, well, Mao Zedong, he's a brutal guy, so I'm not going to sit down with him. No. And you know what? If he thought that way, which Kissinger is a horrible human being, I don't want you to think that, that I like. The guy at all. I know he's one of the worst. He's one of the worst people when talking about political science or international studies. But in any event, he sat down with Mao Zedong. Nixon sat down with Mao Zedong, and we wouldn't have a peaceful relationship with China if that hadn't happened. And as far as Russia, sitting down with Russia, what do we get out of it? We got the anti-ballistic missile treaty. We got the various SALT treaties. We were able to talk about disarmament of the nuclear stockpiles that had built up. We were able to lessen tensions during a very dangerous era of human history. So, kind of noteworthy. And it kind of just pops into my head. It's so obvious that I worry. I worry about the LA Times, for that to be written, and all the good that comes out of talking to a leader of an adversarial nation just doesn't register. Or you're so biased, it does register, but you don't want to mention it. Which is it? Again, the classic equation. Are you ignorant or are you complicit in propaganda? It's hard to tell the two apart sometimes. Which, by the way, in terms of the leader of North Korea, meeting with them, Kim Jong-un, which is so unthinkable nowadays, Bill Clinton had Madeleine Albright go and meet with Kim Jong-un's father, Kim Jong-il. Yeah. And so are we going to, in hindsight, say that's not acceptable anymore? No more meeting with the leader of North Korea? We're not going to do it? Because Buttigieg wanted to be glib and childish about the idea, like Trump meeting with Kim Jong-un, which was a statement that appeals to our visceral hatred of Trump and everything he touches. And yeah, I'm not saying he's ideal to talk to the leader of any nation, but when you start demonizing the concept of meeting with the leaders of an adversarial nation, you are fucking dangerous. You are a dangerous human being to hold the office of the presidency of the United States in an era where we have to fight things like climate change, nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon proliferation, when we have to negotiate treaties with Russia to ensure that nuclear weapons don't proliferate or renegotiate that treaty. You're a dangerous human being. I can't count on you to handle things like reinstating the United States' role in the Iran deal. Because if you won't talk to the leader of North Korea, are you going to talk to the leader of Iran? Well, you won't talk to the leader of this nation, Syria, of North Korea. Are you going to talk to Iran? Is there an Iran deal? Can it happen with your mentality to be so glib? All right, so you need to rethink your support of Pete Buttigieg if you support him. If you're one of the many people that do, in, for example, Iowa and New Hampshire, where he's currently polling first placed and almost first placed, respectively, in those two major critical states that will be voting early in this Democratic primary. And Tulsi Gabbard, hopefully you're not thinking so little of her now. Hey guys, I hope you liked this video. Make sure, if you did, to click like down below and subscribe to this channel. And remember to click the bell. That way you'll get a notification whenever a new video is uploaded. Share this video with whoever you feel might find it valuable. And just remember, the more likes this video gets, the more views, and the more subscriptions, the more this channel can thrive and grow. Thank you.